Hi, it's Mark and welcome back to No Book Left Behind, and today I'll be carrying on my short series on the 4 standalone science fiction novels that Amicus Films turned into movies in the UK in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And today I'll be discussing The Disorientated Man, which as you can see was retitled Scream and Scream Again when it was filmed with Vincent Price, Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. Now, The Disorientated Man was originally published in 1966 by Press Editorial Services and reissued in 1972 under the new Scream and Scream Again title, presumably to tie in with the movie. Now, our story begins behind the Iron Curtain in the offices of the East German Secret Police, and specifically the office of quite a senior member of that organisation whose name is Scheitz. I can't pronounce that any other way. It's Scheitz. Anyway, he's not in it for too long because almost immediately he's killed by his subordinate Conrads, who uses a superhuman neck pinch, which is kind of like Mr. Spock on steroids. And murder is not actually suspected, and Conrads is then elevated to Scheitz's previous position of authority. Meanwhile, prospective Olympic athlete Ken Spartan wakes up in a private room in a hospital with no memory of how he got there. The nurse who attends him won't speak, and when he throws back the covers, he finds out that one of his legs has been amputated. Meanwhile, a young woman is found murdered on Clapham Common. Detective Superintendent Dale Keane gets the call and immediately calls in Sir Thomas Betching to provide the post-mortem, and Sir Thomas brings along Dr. David Vine to assist, who is actually also engaged to his daughter Vicky. It turns out the murdered girl was working in the house of scientist Dr. Malcolm Sanders, and the murders continue, a string of killings of young women picked up from nightclubs, strangled, and then completely drained of all their blood. Now, this is a fairly straightforward potboiler with a kind of sleazy edge to it. It crams in a lot of disparate story elements, and although the story does make sense in the end, it does struggle a bit to bring them into any coherent whole. Instead, it's all about the pace and the action as the narrative jumps from one event to the next with barely time to take a breath. There's no time for even the most cursory character development, and our protagonists are simply defined by their jobs or their roles in the story. David Pine is our hero, Vicky is our heroine, although neither of them get very much to do until the very end of the book. Detective Inspector Keane is simply the man from Scotland Yard, and Malcolm Sanders the sinister scientist who's a suspect, Conrads being the shadowy puppet master who seems to be pulling all the strings from off screen. So although it actually came first, this does feel very much like the novelisation of a movie. It doesn't provide a real point of view from any individual character and just rushes through the events to get to the final page. The plot itself is very 1950s B-movie-like, with these aliens working behind the scenes to create an army of synthetic human duplicates. Like in Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Quatermass 2, they're seeking to place these duplicates in positions of power. But of course, this being a B-movie world, they've only managed to create 3 or 4 of these composite humans so far, rather than an army of them. All the disparate plot threads do tie up satisfactorily at the end, although to be honest, Ken Spartan's ordeal in the hospital bed does feel as if it's been thrown in just for a bit of crude sensationalism. The novel's not bad. It moves swiftly and it's a quick read. It just doesn't feel like there's much imagination at work here, and no real depth to anything that happens. Now, if you're tempted to try any other novels by Saxon, be warned, that's a house name invented by the publisher and would have covered a whole stable of authors. Now, it didn't take too much digging to find out that the real author was a guy called Stephen D. Francis, and that's Francis with an E and not an I. And he also penned the novelisation of the 1968 Peter Cushing movie Corruption, which was a very bad remake of an original film called Eyes Without a Face. which is a horror classic. He also wrote crime fiction, spy adventures, historical fiction, some entries in the Sexton Blake series, and the movie novelisation of the 1978 British sex comedy Adventures of a Plumber's Mate. But he was probably best known for his series of novels featuring Chicago reporter Hank Jansen. These were highly popular in the 1940s and 1950s, but they were a little too racy for the guardians of public morals, which led to prosecutions under the anti-obscenity laws of the time. And this led to bookshops being raided and copies of the books taken and destroyed, as well as eventually the publisher and distributor going to jail in 1954. At the same time, an arrest warrant was issued for Francis too, but that was not really very effective because he was living in Spain at the time and obviously had very little intention of coming back to England under those circumstances. But it all did lead to changes to the anti-obscenity laws, making them more even and uniform across the country, where before they were kind of under the remit of local magistrates to some extent. You can read about it all in a book called The Trial of Hank Jansen by Steve Holland, which is available if you're interested in the subject. And it probably does explain why Francis adopted a pseudonym to write The Disorientated Man. Despite all this, Amicus Films optioned the novel for a movie in 1969, which was directed by Gordon Hessler and released to theatres the following January. And it starred the iconic horror dream team of Vincent Price, Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. Now, coming to the Amicus film, the first thing to mention is that I did see it many, many years ago, and the impression I had of it was that it was a waste of the 3 stars and the story was hopelessly muddled. But my memory of it was extremely vague, and when I was reading the book I couldn't help but picture Christopher Lee in the role of Dr. Malcolm Saunders. After all, he's a cold, aloof, authoritative, dominant figure, and even the way the dialogue is phrased seems to fit in with the speech patterns and delivery that Lee would give to the character. Imagine my surprise when watching the movie when I found out that Saunders was actually played by Vincent Price, and that Lee was relegated to a very peripheral role as the head of British Secret Service. And this means that Lee has only 4 scenes in the film, 2 of them set in his office, and 1 of them being extraordinarily brief. And he only appears with Price in the final scenes. Even worse than that, although Price himself gets top billing, he really isn't in it all that much either. So, given that, obviously Peter Cushing must have a large role in the film instead, right? No. He has 1 scene that's barely 3 minutes long, and he doesn't appear with either Lee or Price. What a waste of the dream team. Recalling the shoot many years later, Lee said that he and Price laughed through most of it, and Price always said that he didn't understand really what the story was all about. And that brings us to my second memory of the film, that it was really confused and hopelessly muddled. And I can see why I had that impression, even though I've now read the book. Now, a lot of the runtime of the film is taken up with the hunt for the vampire killer, and that means quite a few car chases, undercover policewomen hanging out in nightclubs as bait, and generally a lot of time given over to the investigations of Detective Inspector Belliver, played by Alfred Marks, another character renamed for some reason from the book. Now, Marks gives a wonderfully droll performance. His bluntness and down-to-earth demeanour really helps ground the story in the real world. But unfortunately, this does give it all the feel of a gritty police procedural, and that doesn't really seem to have much to do with Vincent Price hanging out in his secret Frankenstein laboratory, mucking about with parts of bodies. It's an awkward tonal clash that the movie really struggles to overcome. And that's a shame, because Marx's performance in this pretty much the best reason to watch it. This awkward clash of tones kind of reminds me of Hammer's attempts to bring Dracula into the modern age in the 1970s. It doesn't really work. Similarly, Ken Spartan's role in proceedings feels even more disconnected from the main narrative here than it does in the book, and the visits to his hospital room just seem to be included for shock value. But please spare a thought for actor Nigel Lambert, whose sole role is to lie in a hospital bed, look scared and shocked, and every now and then throw the covers back to find that another of his limbs has been amputated. However, the most puzzling aspect of the adaptation revolves around one of the major building blocks of the original story. To go back and quote Lee again, "We were all aliens, if I remember rightly." I couldn't work it out at all. But were they? There's no explicit mention of extraterrestrials in the film at all, and the audience could be forgiven for just assuming that this is a Cold War plot by an unnamed Eastern Bloc nation. But we never really find out any specifics, or where the plot has originated. After all, Conrads would seem to be in charge, but then he's obviously one of these composite humans himself. It seems a very curious decision to omit the explanation of an extraterrestrial invasion, as this would be the simplest way of tying everything together and making it make sense. But aside from all that, the film is quite a nice little time capsule of late 1960s swinging London. We get likely fellas out on the prowl in the nightclubs looking for smashing birds. We get the police flying around in panda cars and Wolsey Hornets. And there's always baked beans for tea. The soundtrack bursts out of the speakers with these loud jazzy beats. The colour is turned up to 11. And it's all way out there in the wonderfully polite and reserved way that only the British can manage. So it is quite fun. It's just not very good. And I think that's an accusation you could reasonably level at the book too. Although I must confess I do love the opening. And because I love it so much, I'm going to read you a couple of paragraphs from it, because I think it does give you a very good flavour of what you're going to get if you pick the book up. But now it was night, and the recreation ground was an enormous pool of darkness in which horror and menace lurked. From the core of this darkness came a soft swishing sound as something larger than a house glowed redly for a split second and then died, leaving behind it a ghostly bluish glow. Something moved within that glow, something that wasn't quite human. The thing had arrived. I love it. Corny, but I love it. So that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed that, and thank you all so much for staying with me till the end of it. Have you read the book? Have you seen the movie? What did you think of them? What was the best film that Lee and Cushing made together outside of the Hammer umbrella? And which title is worse here, The Disorientated Man or Scream and Scream Again? I can't make up my mind actually. I think they're both incredibly terrible. What do you think? Put your comments down below, and please composite the like button, subscribe and ring that notification bell. It helps to keep the YouTube algorithm warm at night. And remember, keep rummaging through those second-hand bookstores and those charity shop shelves, because there are treasures out there that only you can find. Cheers.